This is the Hunsrück, a range of hills in the Rhine uplands near the town of Scheeren, the village of Dickenschied. Flax was grown here until the Second World War. Some families continued into the post-war years, and because this village held on a generation longer than most, the knowledge of how to weave linen survived here after it had been forgotten almost everywhere else in the Rhineland. Until the beginning of the 20th century, linen weaving was a significant trade across the Rhine uplands, mostly done as a secondary income, mostly done to clothe the household, mostly done in autumn and winter when the fields did not need working. By 1978, Wilhelm Mosel and Otto Klos were among the last people who still remembered how. The farmhouse at Kirchbergstrasse 27. Two men come out of the red door, Wilhelm Mosel, Otto Klos, both old enough to have watched this work as children, both old enough to remember exactly how it was done. Mosel carries the heavy woven basket. Inside, large wooden spools wound with fine white linen yarn, spun by hand the previous winter. Each spool holds up to 2,000 meters of thread. They carry the basket across the courtyard, up the wooden stairs, and into the room where the work will happen, the weaving chamber, where this village stored its knowledge for 200 years. The room holds everything needed for the first stage of linen production. In the center, the warping mill, called the Scheerkrone in the Hunsrück, a tall rotating wooden frame roughly 5 meters in circumference. Against the wall, the spool rack, a tall wooden stand fitted with metal pins, 1 spool per pin, all spinning freely. In the corner, the iron stove. Beside it, the spinning wheel that produced every thread in this basket through the long work of winter evenings. The men load the spools onto the rack one by one. They do not hurry. This process, called Schären, requires that every thread runs true and every count is exact. There is no tolerance for error here. The Scheerbrett, a flat wooden paddle with 2 rows of small holes. This board controls the threading. Every spool feeds 1 thread through 1 hole in this paddle. The holes keep the threads separated, parallel, individual, untangled, as they travel from the rack to the mill. Without this board, the threads would cross. A crossed thread becomes a knot. A knot in the warp means a flaw in every meter of cloth woven from it. The men examine the board carefully, count the holes, check that each one is clear. For a basic linen weave, at least 20 spools are needed. This chain will use 36. Each thread is pulled from its spool and fed through its hole in the paddle, one by one. 36 spools, 36 holes, 36 threads pulled through by hand. When all threads are through, Mosel gathers them into a single bunch and ties a heavy knot at the end. All 36 threads locked together. He carries the paddle to the warping mill and slips the knot over the top peg. Now the most important step before a single turn of the mill can happen, the Lease cross. Mosel uses his index finger and thumb to divide the bunch of threads into 2 groups, alternating, 1 thread up, 1 thread down, up, down, through the full width of the bunch. This crossing, this figure-8 separation, is the structural memory of the warp. It records the order of every thread before the winding begins. Without it, the threads are just a bundle. With it, they are a warp, a precise arrangement that the loom will be able to read months from now when the cloth is finally woven. He slides the top group onto one peg and the bottom group onto the adjacent peg. The cross is mounted. Otto Klos takes hold of the mill frame. Mosel holds the paddle. They are ready. Everything that follows is counting. The mill begins to turn. Klos rotates the frame clockwise. Mosel holds the paddle back, maintaining tension, guiding the thread band diagonally downward as the frame rotates. Behind them on the rack, 36 spools spin simultaneously. Yarn pulls off each one at exactly the rate the mill demands. The band of threads descends the frame in a slow diagonal. When it reaches the bottom peg, Mosel loops it around and Klos reverses the rotation. Counterclockwise now. The band climbs back upward. 1 full pass down and 1 full pass up is called a gang. 1 gang. The circumference of this mill is 5 meters. The cloth they are making will be 13.5 meters long. That requires 4 turns per gang. When the first gang is complete, Klos reaches for the chalk and draws a tally mark on the wooden post. They are making 36 Gänge in total. 36 passes, 1,440 individual threads wound in sequence onto this frame. 1 mark on the post, 35 to go. The mill turns again. The rhythm settles. Down, reverse, up, reverse, down. Mosel guides the paddle. Klos turns the frame. Neither speaks. The threads stretch across the room from the spool rack to the mill, a diagonal fan of fine white lines under constant tension. Every time the thread band reaches the top, Mosel forms the Lease cross again with his fingers. Up, down, then mounts it on the 2 pegs. Every time the band reaches the bottom, he loops it around the lower peg and reverses. Each gang is set slightly higher or lower than the one before it, not stacked directly on top. This is deliberate. If each successive gang were wound exactly on top of the previous one, the outermost threads, the ones added last, would be longer than the innermost ones. The cloth would not lie flat. The tension would be uneven. The loom would fight the weaver at every pass of the shuttle. So each gang is offset, slightly higher, slightly lower, alternating. The accumulated bundle grows evenly from the center outward. From above, the overhead shot shows it clearly. Threads stretching the full width of the room, the mill at one end, the rack at the other. 36 lines of yarn running in parallel, not touching, not crossing, each one tracking its own path through its own hole in the paddle. Klos makes another chalk mark, another gang complete. The pile of marks grows on the post. The pile of thread grows on the mill. The room is getting quieter. Both men have entered the state that all repetitive precision work produces, not boredom and not automation, something between concentration and meditation. Every hand position identical to the last, every turn of the mill exactly like the one before. The mill stops. Mosel has felt something wrong in the tension of the threads. He looks closely at the band. A thread has broken. He pulls the 2 broken ends free from the bundle, holds them between his fingers. Now the weaver's knot, a specific knot used exclusively in textile work. Not a square knot, not a reef knot. The weaver's knot, a loop tied in one motion that produces a join as thin and flat as possible, because a thick knot in a warp thread creates a lump in the cloth. A lump catches the shuttle. A caught shuttle breaks the rhythm and sometimes breaks the thread again. So the knot must be small, almost invisible, pulled tight with 2 fingers and the excess snapped off clean. Mosel releases the repaired thread back into the taut group. It disappears into the bundle, indistinguishable from the rest. Klos begins turning the mill again. The winding continues as if the break never happened. After every 5 completed Gänge, a control cord is tied around the bundle, not for decoration, for counting. When the finished warp is eventually mounted on the loom, the weaver must be able to verify exactly how many threads it contains. The control cords divide the bundle into countable sections of 5. Then, a spool runs out. Klos pulls the empty wooden spool from its pin and carries it across the room to the spinning wheel. He mounts the empty spool on the spindle, takes a new supply of yarn, winds the end around the spool twice, then drives the large wheel with his right hand and guides the yarn evenly onto the spool with his left. The wheel turns, the spool fills. He carries it back, mounts it on the rack, ties the new thread end to the old one with another weaver's knot. The mill turns again. No time is wasted. The final Gänge. The men count carefully now, both watching the tally marks on the post, both aware that the number must be exact. 36 Gänge, 36 passes of 40 threads each, 1,440 threads in total, each one the full length of the cloth, each one in its correct order preserved by the Lease cross at the top. For very wide or very fine cloth, the kind that required several thousand warp threads, the chain had to be made in 2 or 3 separate sessions. The mill could not hold that much at once. For this cloth, a plain household linen, 1 session is enough. Mosel raises the paddle for the final pass. The threads lay over the top pegs for the 36th time. He forms the Lease cross one last time, separates the threads with his fingers, mounts the 2 groups on the 2 pegs. Klos counts the bands at the top, touches each one, counts again. 36. The winding is done. 1,440 threads wound in sequence and in order onto this 5-meter wooden frame in a single continuous operation. Now the warp must be secured before it can be removed from the mill. If the threads are taken off the frame without being locked in place, the Lease cross will collapse. The thread order will be lost, and 1,440 threads will become an indistinguishable tangle that no human hand can sort. The weaver's entire winter of spinning would be destroyed in seconds. So every point of the warp is tied before the frame is touched. First, the top. A cord fed through the Lease cross itself, through the opening between the two groups, and tied firmly around the outside. The cross is now preserved permanently as a physical structure inside the bundle. It will survive the removal. It will survive the journey to the loom. It will still be there when the threads are mounted weeks from now. A second knot over the first, then the bottom loop tied the same way. Then the crossbar. The horizontal wooden beam at the top of the mill is what holds the frame open under tension. Removing it releases the warp. The men grasp the bar together, wiggle it free from its sockets. The threads, no longer under tension, sag slightly as the bar comes out. Mosel lifts the entire warp free of the upper pegs, holds the bundle in his arms. 1,440 threads, the full chain for a linen cloth 13.5 meters long, all of it now in his hands, still in order, still intact. The Lease cross still preserved inside the bundle exactly as he tied it. He steps back, holds the end taut. The chaining begins. Chaining. Mosel loops the warp through itself, pulling each new section through the loop that came before it. A thick braid forms, a chain that compresses over 10 meters of thread into something manageable, something that fits in a basket. He works fast now. The rhythm is different from the winding, less counting, more feel. The hands know how much tension to maintain and how large each loop should be. As he chains downward, the thread unwinds from the mill. Klos guides it off the frame as Mosel pulls it into the braid. The chain shortens the warp by a third. 10 meters becomes 7. 7 becomes 5. The basket fills with thick white rope that is not rope, that is 1,440 separate threads in perfect order waiting for the loom. This chaining, this method of removal, is where the word Kette comes from, the German word for warp. Kette means chain. The warp takes its name from the way it is taken off the mill. When the last loop comes free from the bottom peg, Mosel lowers the chain into the basket. The basket now holds the equivalent of a full winter's spinning, compressed into a single braid that can be carried in one hand. Klos pulls the remaining yarn from the paddle holes and winds it back onto the spools. Nothing is wasted. What is left over stays on the spools until the next session of Schären, or is wound onto smaller shuttle spools for the weft. The men disassemble the mill, the tall frame taken apart, the pieces leaned against the wall, the spool rack carried to the corner, the room cleared. The floor where the mill stood is empty now. The equipment is stored. The Scheerkrone, the warping mill, the Scheerbrett, the threading paddle, the Spoolengatte, the spool rack, the spool rod, the spinning wheel, all of it made by the village carpenter, simply constructed enough that the weaver could repair it himself when something broke. No specialist needed, no parts to order, wood and iron and knowledge. In the 19th century, a separate profession existed, the Lohnweber, the hired chainmaker. A specialist who traveled between workshops making warp chains on commission for weavers who did not have the space or the equipment to do it themselves. But in the farmhouse linen trade, the bäuerliche Leinenweberei, the weaver made his own chain. Always. It was not a task to be delegated. The chain carries too much information for anyone else to be trusted with it. The number of threads, the length of the cloth, the position of every Lease cross, the arrangement that will determine how the loom is threaded and how the finished cloth will lie. Wilhelm Mosel and Otto Klos learned all of this as children, watching their parents and grandparents in this same room or rooms like it across the Hunsrück. They did not learn it from a book. There was no book. There was only the room and the mill and the hands of someone who already knew. The basket sits on the floor, the thick white chain coiled inside it. ready for the next stage, mounting the warp on the loom. That will happen in another film. Close-up of the chain. Individual threads visible through the braid. 1,440 of them, each one the length of a cloth that does not yet exist. By the time this film was made, almost no one in the Rhineland still knew how to make this chain. Wilhelm Mosel and Otto Klos remembered. This film is the record of what they remembered. Because once these skills are gone, the Lease cross, the weaver's knot, the chalk marks on the wooden post, all that remains is the record. Subscribe. More of these trades are coming.